Over the course of the 20th century, the appetite for mind-altering chemicals in America spread like a brush fire. The prohibition on these drugs in the United States and elsewhere created a huge demand which criminals and corrupt government actors in Mexico were more than willing to fill. The black markets created by prohibition flourished, propelling poor, everyday criminals in Mexico into the stratospheres of power. These men are the first cartel bosses of the drug trade. They are the Godfathers of Mexico. Gulf Cartel founder Juan Nepomuceno Guerra. Juan Nepomuceno Guerra Cardenas was born on July 18, 1915 in Matamoros, which is located in the state of Tamaulipas, Mexico, though some sources, including a World War II draft card signed by Guerra himself, state that his place of birth was in fact in Texas. The first of 9 children born to cattle rancher Placidio Guerra Gomez and Maria Eloisa Cardenas Benavides, Juan Nepomuceno Guerra grew up chopping cotton, hauling wood, and tending mules on his father's ranch during the Depression. The Guerras were poor by today's standards, but the family ranch put food on the table and kept a roof over their heads, which in Mexico during those times put them closer to the middle class. Needing more money to support his family, Juan Nepomuceno Guerra began his criminal career working for top smuggler and gang leader Virgilio Barrera at the youthful age of 12 years old. It was common back then for young children to work full-time, and Juan was no exception. He would then join Barrera's gang, which was named Los Pasadores. Barrera and Los Pasadores rose to prominence in northeast Mexico due to the prohibition of alcohol in the United States. Much like the Italian La Cosa Nostra families did on the East Coast, Barrera and his gang were perfectly positioned to supply alcohol to thirsty Americans in Texas and throughout the southwestern United States. Barrera and his gang would often use burros to smuggle alcohol and other contraband across the desert in the United States. Soldiers fighting in the Mexican Revolution were also involved in smuggling. Working for Barrera, Guerra would learn the ins and the outs of the contraband smuggling business. With little competition in northeast Mexico, Los Pasadores operated peacefully and with impunity. Barrera and his gang ruled the states of Nuevo León, Coahuila, and his base of operations, Tamaulipas. However, things would take a bad turn for Virgilio Barrera when in October of 1929, he would be arrested for smuggling and other crimes. He would receive a long prison sentence, creating a power vacuum in the northeast Mexican underworld. Though only 14 at the time of Barrera's arrest, Guerra, along with his brothers Arturo and Roberto, began smuggling whiskey, tequila, and beer themselves, bringing the contraband from Mexico into South Texas during the last days of the Prohibition era in the United States. It was even rumored that Guerra supplied Chicago outfit boss Al Capone with whiskey and tequila, though this is unsubstantiated. Prohibition was repealed in the United States in 1933. However, because of statewide dry laws in Texas, smuggling alcohol remained lucrative for Guerra until those laws were finally repealed in 1935. Due to this, Guerra had to resort to smuggling other products and various other rackets and businesses to make money. Guerra moved into the business of gun running, gambling houses, human trafficking, and auto theft. Many historians state that he began importing marijuana and opium into the United States even back then. However, the narcotics would not become the mainstay of his operation until the early 1970s. With the Mexican Revolution at its end, many of the former soldiers involved in the smuggling trade in the 1920s now held prominent positions in the Mexican military as well as the government. Guerra used these political and military connections to shore up his power base. Through these shrewd political connections he'd fostered throughout the 1930s, Guerra was able to control all of the contraband moving across the Rio Grande into Texas. And by the 1940s, he was the most powerful smuggler in northeastern Mexico. It was during this time that he would court and marry Gloria Elvira Landeros. Landeros was a singer in a popular road show. During the show's visit to Matamoros, she would meet Guerra and be swept off her feet. The two would marry and have 3 children: Juan Nepomuceno Guerra Landeros, Maria Manuela Guerra Landeros, and Laura Odilia Guerra Landeros. The marriage would end violently, however, when one day an actor and comedian friend of Landeros' roadshow days named Adalberto Martinez stopped by to pay her a visit. Martinez, better known by his stage name Resortes, was chatting with Landeros when Juan Guerra happened upon them. There is no record of exactly what occurred that day, but rumor has it that Guerra fell into a jealous rage and killed Landeros while wounding Resortes. He would be arrested, but was quickly released when the killing was ruled to be in self-defense. Whether the killing was actually in self-defense or was just a case of Guerra using his influence to get away with murder is lost to time. However, the few hours spent in lockup that day was one of the very few times Juan Guerra would ever spend in a jail or police station. When asked about this incident in an interview with Sam Dillon of the New York Times in 1996, Guerra would state cryptically, "I don't live by dreams, but by realities, and what I don't like, I leave along the way." Throughout his life, Juan Guerra would father 6 other children by 2 other wives. In the Netflix docudrama Narcos Mexico, Juan N. Guerra is depicted as a friendly, grandfatherly figure that uses violence only as a necessity and is put off by the way that Miguel Ángel Felix Gallardo does business. This caricature does not describe the real man, who is both hot-tempered and violent. Another example of Guerra's arrogance and violent tendencies came when Commander Francisco Villa Cos, who was the son of renowned Mexican hero and outlaw Pancho Villa, raised his voice to Guerra at a dinner the 2 men attended. For this transgression, Guerra had the man killed. Guerra had such power and connections that the lawyer representing him in the case also happened to be the state prosecutor of Tamaulipas. This man's name was Francisco Castellano Twixy. And not only was he a state prosecutor, Castellano Twixy was also the former governor of the state. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, he would continue to build his political clout. He was well protected by both politicians and military officials. In 1963, he attempted to get his brother Roberto, also a member of the cartel, elected governor of the state of Tamaulipas. Though Roberto Guerra would lose his election, he would later be appointed the head of the Tamaulipas tax office. This happened to be the very office in charge of combating smuggling in the state. Juan Guerra's political power continued to grow when his close associate, Emilio Martinez Manetao, was appointed personal secretary to President Gustavo Díaz Ordaz. He would later be appointed Secretary of Health under President José López Portillo. During this time, Guerra even began making connections on the other side of the border, befriending officials in local Texas municipalities. Over time, Guerra also enlisted a group of seasoned sicarios that handled protection for Guerra himself as well as his cartel lieutenants. They also functioned as a death squad, murdering anyone threatening cartel business. This enforcement wing of the cartel was led by the Del Fierro brothers. Roland, Luis, Ricardo, Procopio, Eleazar, and Daniel Del Fierro each had a group of sicarios loyal to Don Juan N. Guerra. These friends would often come in handy when it came to running his illicit businesses. Guerra would also invest in legitimate enterprises, which included construction, nightclubs, brothels, bars, and restaurants, among other things. One of his bars, named Piedra Negras, became a favorite of his. It became a headquarters of sorts where he would meet with associates and supplicants throughout the day. By the time the early 70s rolled around, the Guerra organization had completed its transformation into what would become known as the Gulf Cartel. Guerra would take his nephew, Juan Garcia Abrego, under his wing and school him on the many rackets the Gulf Cartel was involved in. Juan Garcia Abrego was born on September 13, 1944, in Tamaulipas, Mexico. His uncle Juan would put Abrego in charge of the cartel's stolen car racket at an early age, which he ran with his best friend, Lictor Haziel Marroquin Garcia. By the mid-1970s, Abrego would be Juan Guerra's right-hand man. Abrego began pushing the cartel more and more into the drug trade, running marijuana and heroin into the United States. As the decade continued, Abrego convinced Guerra to make a deal with the Cali cartel in Cumbia to smuggle their cocaine into the United States for a surcharge of $1,500 per kilo. Guerra agreed so long as Abrego dealt with the Colombians personally. In this way, Guerra kept his hands clean, at least in his own eyes. Guerra began handing more and more control to his nephew Abrego and began to focus on other hobbies such as horse breeding and horse racing. In the 1996 interview with Sam Dillon of the New York Times, Guerra described a race in 1965 when a thoroughbred he owned named Black Bull made him the equivalent of $80,000. During this interview, Dillon describes one of Guerra's bodyguards breaking into song. The song went, "Black Bull was a racehorse, the very best of his era. The earth shook when he ran, defending Don Juan N. Guerra." The song seemed to please the elderly trafficker, as horses were a lifelong love of his. It is believed, however, that Guerra remained in charge of the Gulf Cartel throughout the 1970s, despite his nephew, Juan Garcia Abrego, taking a larger hand in day-to-day operations. During the 1980s, the cartel's power hit its zenith when Guerra's old friend, Emilio Martinez Manatao, was elected governor of Tamaulipas, and Don Juan Guerra's son, Jesus Roberto Guerra, was elected mayor of Matamoros. With political protection sewn up at the state and local level, cocaine was flooding across the Rio Grande into the United States, and money was flooding back across into Mexico. During this time, Juan Garcia Abrego slowly began handling more and more of the cartel's day-to-day operations. Many reporters and historians trace the Gulf Cartel's final transition of power from Juan N. Guerra to his nephew, Juan Garcia Abrego, to a meeting in 1987 between Garcia Abrego and a powerful member of the DFS named Thomas Morlet. While being a member of the DFS, which was Mexico's national police force, Morlet was also a powerful drug trafficker in his own right. An argument ensued between Morlet and Garcia Abrego. A gunfight erupted, leaving Morlet dead and one of Garcia Abrego's bodyguards wounded. Being both a top trafficker and a member of the DFS made Morlet a formidable adversary, so killing him was sure to make waves in the narco underworld. It is believed at this point, either out of Guerra's desire to avoid the backlash the murder of Morlet created and live his final years in relative peace, or out of respect for his nephew for murdering such a high-level narco trafficker, Guerra handed full control of the Gulf Cartel to his nephew, Juan Garcia Abrego, though many still believe he exercised veto powers over high-level cartel decisions. By the 1990s, Guerra had completely withdrawn from cartel affairs, even giving a few interviews including the aforementioned New York Times interview with Sam Dillon. He would soon after lose the movement of half his body due to a stroke. Finally, with his kidneys failing him, Guerra, presumably suffering from depression, withdrew from friends, family, and even his doctors. Juan N. Guerra would die on July 12, 2001 in Matamoros. While the Netflix series Narcos Mexico depicted Guerra as a friendly, grandfatherly figure that abhors the way Felix Gallardo did business and only used violence sparingly, the truth of the man is nowhere near as flattering. While Guerra may not have used the sadistic tactics of Los Zetas or the public displays of intimidation favored by the Arellano Felix organization and later the NFG of Jalisco, he was in fact a callous, arrogant man with a fiery temper who killed for the smallest of infractions and believed himself above the law. Still, there are those in the city of Matamoros in the state of Tamaulipas who revere him as a man who helped many in the community and cared for those in the area that he came from. He may be all of these things. However, without a doubt, history will remember him as one of the original cartel godfathers of Mexico.